Hello, students of U.S. History 2201. This is your professor, James Cement. I hope this finds you safe and healthy, you and your loved ones. Like the rest of you, I am hunkered down, practicing responsible social distancing. I'm in my home office in Los Angeles, and we're going to be I'm going to be putting my lectures for this week online. There are going to be three of them. They're shorter than our normal lectures in class. We're all trying to make do with the situation that we have at hand. And we'll be talking about sort of the spread of democracy in the United States in its first 50 or 60 years following the Constitution. But before we get into that, I want to just talk to you about what I'm planning on doing with the class moving forward. So this week, these lectures are going to go online, and at the end of each of these three mini lectures, there's going to be a quiz based on the contents of the lecture, and you will answer the quiz questions. They're multiple choice. They're at the end. They're on the last slide of each lecture. And what I want you to do is, and they're numbered sequentially. So the first lecture might have 1 through 4 or something, the next one 5 through 7, and the third one I think goes 8 through 10. Save all of your answers until you finish all three of the lectures and then send them to me as one document. In addition to that, please add your writing assignment for this week to the end of your quiz answers in the same document. So that first you'll have the 10 quiz questions answered, and then you'll add your writing document. If you don't want to do that, send it 2 documents. I can deal with that, but I'm trying not to get hundreds of documents of like the first 4 questions. So put all your quiz answers into one document. In addition to that, when you do the quiz, you don't need to write out the answers or the questions. Each question has a number, so you'll put the number of the question, and then you will put the letter answer. So it might be 1B, 2C, that kind of thing. Okay, that's all you need to put in the quiz answers. And that'll be just for this week that we're going to be doing this online lectures. Starting next week at our usual meeting time for 2201.03, that's going to be 7 to 8:15 in the evening. And for 2201.6, that will be from 4 to 5:15 in the afternoon. And these will be on Tuesday and Thursday. It's going to follow our regular times. We are going to be doing a synchronous lecture. We are going to do it on the Zoom platform. And I'm also going to record the lecture for those of you who may not be able to attend. You will be able to call it up. I'm not going to go into detailed instructions about how to use Zoom and where to find these lectures if you don't attend them synchronously, or how to attend them synchronously. All of those are going to be contained in a Blackboard announcement I'm going to send out this weekend to all of you. So you will be able to, if you can, it would be great if you could participate in the synchronous lecture. That is the actual real-time lecture that I'm going to be providing from here in my home office with a slideshow. It'll try to resemble as close as I can the lecture that we have in class. You will be able to participate by being online. Now, that said, and once it's done, I will record it. And just so you're all aware, I'm going to put all of this stuff up onto in a program they have here at Cal Poly called Kaltura, and it can only be viewed by members of the Cal Poly community. So, and you will have a choice on Zoom whether you want to have your video on so that everybody can see you, or you can turn your video off. You can keep your audio on if you want to ask a question, and you will be able to turn the audio off if you don't want to be heard at all. So if you have issues about privacy, you might think about turning the video off. When we open that first synchronous lecture on Tuesday at 4 o'clock for my 2201.6 class and 7 o'clock for a 2201.3 class, at that point I will be I'll be giving instructions on how to operate Zoom. Many of you are already probably familiar with it from before. or from other classes, because we're, all of us professors, many of us professors are going to be throwing stuff up onto Zoom, and so you're already aware of it. But some of you who aren't, I will be providing a sort of a very brief tutorial at the beginning of the lecture on Tuesday. And if you miss the Tuesday lecture, then it will be recorded and placed into Blackboard. And I'll tell you in a Blackboard announcement where you will find it on Blackboard for your class. So I think that kind of wraps up what we're going to be doing this week. I'm going to turn off my camera now and just have what's on my screen show up in this video. All right, I have turned off the camera that shows me in my home office, and now you're just seeing what is on the PowerPoint presentation for this week's lecture, or the first of this week's 3 lectures. So some of the things we're going to be talking about in this first lecture for week 8 is a kind of a general discussion of what is a nation and what is a state. We're also going to take a look at this concept called an imagined political community, and what does it have to do with the long history of humanity. So we're going to be going kind of a long look, sort of a 40,000 foot view of the history of humanity and the creation of nation states. And then we're going to focus in on the United States specifically and talk about what it means to be a citizen of a nation state. And what does the Constitution have to say about that? And what does it not say? We're also going to take a look at something that's in the Constitution called the Comity Clause, and how, and this is very important, how it leaves defining a citizen not to the nation state as a whole, but to the individual states that are part of it. We're also going to take a look at who were citizens, who was a citizen without rights in this new nation state, who were not even considered citizens, and who were not considered part of America as this imagined political community. Also, just one more word about this online lecture. Like many of you, I am stuck in my home with others in the home. I have 2 children who are home from school, and so if you hear noises in the background, I've told them to be quiet, but they don't always listen to me, so you may hear noises in the background. All right, let us proceed. So the first question we have to ask ourselves to talk about the United States upon the ratification of the Constitution of the birth of the United States. Actually, of course, the United States was born in 1776, but the Constitution was such a radically different organization of our government that we can begin our discussion here. And first, we need to begin with the question of what a nation is and what a state is. And I mean here not states like California or Florida or New York, but the state, meaning the national government. And we're also going to take a look at what a citizen is. So getting back to a nation state, isn't merely a political entity, a place with a sovereign government, that is a government that exercises its power over all of the inhabitants in a given territory defined by specific borders. Well, yes, that is a definition of a nation state, the nation being sort of the people and the state being the official government of that nation. But a nation is something else. It is also what we might call an imagined community or imagined political community. And that's what I want to take a look at now. So to give a little bit of a background to this, human beings, of course, are social creatures, and we are not alone in this. Most of our ape cousins, for example, are highly social creatures. They live in communities, and as by the way, our dogs, for example, that's why we get along with them so well. But ape communities are limited in size, right? They cannot grow too big because all the relationships within ape community have to be personal. Every member literally knows every other member, and that's how these groups stay coherent and part of a single group. Now, our hominid ancestors were the same way, but with the development of our larger brains, our expansive brains that we developed as Homo sapiens, we gained the ability through our imaginations, imagining ourselves belonging to groups that were and identifying with those groups. We gained the ability where we can feel like and imagine that we are part of a much larger community where we don't know everybody. we are, as far as we know, we are the only species that can do this, right? To live in these vast communities that we feel like we belong to. Now, some of you might say, well, what about ants or bees or sardines? There may be thousands in a single colony of these of ants or bees, but with them, that belonging, that sense of belonging to this larger community, it's instinctive. It's just hardwired into them by evolution. With us, it's something that we can create and recreate even in our own lifetimes. You know, you can be a citizen of the United States, feel like you're an American, or more likely, let's say you feel like, you know, you grow up in Ireland, or you grow up in China, or you grow up, or you come from there and you immigrate to the United States, and you sort of change what community you feel like you belong to. Simply by moving, so you can imagine yourself in a new, a very large scale community. And so we can see through most of human history, even after the development of our imaginations, we lived in very small groups where we kind of knew each other. And human beings, you know, anthropologists argue that, you know, basically we're capable of knowing about 150 people in a personal kind of way. And those kinds of groups, that was typical of hunter-gatherer groups. But of course, even hunters and gatherers, and certainly those who settled down into villages with the agricultural revolution of about 10,000 years ago, can identify as being part of a community that's larger than 150, based on an imagined sense of belonging, typically based on language, custom, religious beliefs, that kind of thing. We all feel like we can belong to, you know, even people who lived in clans might periodically meet with other clans who spoke the same language, had the same customs, and feel part of this larger community, even if they weren't in the same political group. They weren't ruled by the same government. And you saw that film about the Cherokee, and they definitely had a sense of belonging to a larger group, a tribe. And I'll get to that in the third lecture for this week when we'll talk about what the meaning of tribe is. But again, human beings for most of our history have lived in these small groups, but once we developed these larger brains about 75,000, 100,000 years ago, and the ability to imagine ourselves as bigger groups, we were capable of feeling like we belong to these larger imagined communities. But again, with the rise of agricultural-based societies about 10,000 years ago, and then civilized states about 5,000 years ago, suddenly the numbers of people belonging to a single political entity, city-state, kingdom, empire, grew exponentially to include thousands and ultimately millions and tens of millions of people. And of course, in something like the United States, where we all feel like we belong to this political community known as the United States, we identify with it. You know, we're talking hundreds of millions of people. And the United States, of course, is one such entity. It is a nation state, a collection of peoples that felt they were all part of one community under one government occupying a clearly defined territory. Now, the question is, who belongs in that community? All, including women, including slaves, including Indians, lived in that defined territory and were subject to the sovereign authority of the federal government. But they were often not considered to be part of that community. So take women, for example. They were definitely part of the imagined community of the United States, but they had no right to participate in its governance. Slaves, well, were they really part of the imagined community? Not really, because they were completely excluded as human beings from participating in this community. So while they lived in this territory and were subject to the laws of the territory of the United States, the dominant group, whites, did not consider them to be part of this community. And Indians, while also subjected to the sovereign power of the federal government, and so were under the control of the state, in Washington, but were also not considered part of the national community. Although, as we saw with the Cherokee, they very much wanted to be considered part of the community, this imagined political community known as the United States, and sort of adapted their style of living and their belief system and their religion. And they developed a written language, all of these things, so that they could sort of adapt to this dominant community and become members of it. The dominant community did not really necessarily consider them to be part of it. And so when the Constitution was ratified, the United States as we know it was born in the late 1780s, the question then became who was a full member of this nation state, this community, with all the rights and privileges. In other words, a citizen. But who was really a citizen, meaning who could have a say in the governance of the nation? This is especially important in a republic like the United States. For example, in a monarchy, everybody's subject to the sovereign power of the king. But of course, and he and the king, the monarch, is sort of the embodiment of the state, and everybody is a subject thereof of him. But of course, in a republic, the sovereign power is the people. And so, who is a member of this thing called the people? Now, the Constitution, interestingly enough, says very little on the subject of who is a citizen. It kind of distinguishes who may be a citizen, but it doesn't actually say who actually is a citizen. Now, in many countries around the world, the idea of who belongs to this imagined community, who gets the rights and privileges and immunities, protections of this community, is based on a common national identity, based on what the Germans called Blut und Boden, or blood and soil. And that is the idea that the German people have a shared ancestry and that they are all tied through long, long historical ties to a given territory known as Germany. But of course, that blood and soil idea is not the American way, because of course, we don't have a common ancestry. Even if we're just talking about white people, I mean, they come from Ireland, and they come from Italy, and they come from Russia, and they come from all over the place. And so there is no sense of a shared ancestry. We don't all sort of trace our origins back to what we believe to be sort of this common blood, that in places where they have a much more longer history of living in a given territory may share. Sometimes it's totally imagined. I mean, there is no sort of common ancestry among Germans. It is something that gets manufactured, and it's part of our imagined emphasis to underline the imagined part of the community. But of course, the United States can't do that. We don't have this possibility because we come from all over the place. And of course, our territory has been constantly expanding. And indeed, in the treaties that expanded America, for example, when we when President Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, or in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo following the Mexican-American War, where much of the Southwest was absorbed into the United States, or the treaty that brought the Oregon Territory to the United States. What happened is that in those treaties, citizenship was offered to certain inhabitants of those territories. So they became sort of absorbed into the American community as citizens. It was part of the treaties that absorbed these territories. But again, it was the right kind of people. It was generally white people in those territories. Now, the United States offers two other ways to citizenship, besides being absorbed by territorial expansion. Of course, the United States hasn't territorially expanded in quite some time. So there are two other ways, of course. And one is to be naturally born here. And that, by the way, has that one distinction of only the president has to be somebody who is a citizen who is born in the United States. And that's the only kind of advantage that a natural born citizen has. And then there's, of course, naturalization, which gives you full citizenship, except for that presidency business, by moving here. And, we have we have requirements, passing a test, other things, and you then become a full citizen. But again, even though the United States talks about ways to become a citizen, it doesn't actually talk about what makes for a citizen. What are the rights and privileges? What are the rights and privileges and immunities that you get as a citizen? That is not really determined by the Constitution itself. And complicating things is our federal system. That is, the fact that sovereignty, ultimate governing power, is divided between the federal government and the governments of the various states, such as California or New York. And the Constitution has within it something that is called the Comity Clause. Basically, what the Comity Clause says is it says that basically it prohibits states from discriminating concerning rights and privileges of their own citizens and those who come from other states. That is, if I move to Nevada, I can gamble just as much as people who are actually residents of Nevada. Nevada cannot discriminate in those ways. So that, not that Nevada ever would, because they want, to take my money at the casinos. But in other words, that a state that offers immunities and privileges to its own citizens has to offer to anybody who comes into its territory that is a citizen of another state. And so what the Comity Clause really does is, what it really says, that then what the Comity Clause really implies, in fact, is that rights, privileges, and immunities that go with citizenship are not determined by the federal government, but they're determined by the states itself. And that is what is known as the Comity Clause. But while the Comity Clause still stands. It has been kind of amended to a certain degree by the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War to extend citizenship to all the persons who had been enslaved prior to the Civil War. African Americans had been enslaved prior to the Civil War. And under the 14th Amendment, it declares that all persons born in the United States are citizens, period. They are citizens of the United States. With the same rights. So no state can deny those privileges and immunities, except, of course, that they did when it came to African Americans, but they had to do it in a kind of roundabout way when they tried to exclude them from voting. They couldn't go ahead and say, no, African Americans can vote, because now under the 14th Amendment, everybody born in the United States is automatically a citizen of the United States, and they are entitled to all the rights and privileges of that status. But that is something really for later American history, for post-Civil War American history, something that I talk about in 2202 that we don't really talk about in this class. We might get to it maybe in the last week of the class if we get there. But for now, we're dealing with the pre-Civil War America, pre-14th Amendment America. And the status for free black men would largely remain unchanged until after the Civil War, and for women until the 19th Amendment the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920, which allowed voting, and some allowed women to vote. And even today, some women are, there's a big push to get this Equal Rights Amendment today, which has been proposed for decades now, to grant full citizenship rights as Americans to all women. It's kind of strange to think that this is still controversial today, but in fact, a lot of people argue that we need this Equal Rights Amendment to basically do for women what the 14th Amendment did for African American men after the Civil War. That is, basically deny the ability of any state to pass any kind of law that denies certain rights and privileges to its female citizens. So anyways, but again, going back to the pre-Civil War era, the antebellum era, as it's called, in fact, the Constitution separates Americans into three groups generally. It has Indians, who are considered part of independent tribes, like the Cherokee. There's in the Constitution that reference to other persons, which of course we know really means slaves, who are both of which are not citizens. And then the third group is the people, as in we the people in the Constitution, which was really meant to mean white people, with white women having truncated rights. And all of this brings us back to the question of national identity. That is, who belongs to the imagined political community that is the United States, as opposed to who is simply subject to the jurisdiction of the laws herein. And clearly what we have in the United States, even in antebellum times, and this is something we'll get to in the next couple of lectures, is this idea of civic nationalism. We talked about blood and soil as being the basis for a national identity in long-established states like Germany or France. But in the United States, of course, we don't have that. What we have is what's called a civic nationalism, a community of all those who are defined as citizens, but not based on common ancestry, as long as, of course, they're white, or come from a specific place. National identity in the United States is defined by our shared political beliefs, as enshrined in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, not in our origins or common ancestry. And this brings us to another issue. Again, the Constitution is very vague on what constitutes a citizen, leaving it largely to the states to define it back then. Nowadays, it is the 14th Amendment has expanded it. Has expanded the idea of expanded federal power to determine what is a citizen. But in the pre-Civil War era, it was really determined by the states. And so what we need to do, what we're going to look at next time, is what did the first states do about citizenship? We know that they almost uniformly excluded African Americans from full citizenship, uniformly limited the citizenship rights of women. But what about the white men? And that's what we're going to take a look at next time. What was the definition of citizenship for the dominant group in the United States in the pre-Civil War era, white men? And that's what we're going to turn to in the next lecture. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on the screen the quiz for this particular lecture, for the first lecture of week 8. And again, you will answer these questions 1, 2, 3, and 4 with a letter answer, and you will save them in a Microsoft Word document. And then when you look at the other lectures, they too will be followed by a quiz that will begin. The next one will begin with the question 5, and you will submit these quiz answers all in one document to me no later than Sunday, please. And that's it for about now go to the next lecture, lecture 2 for week 8, where we will talk about sort of this idea of expanding of what citizenship meant in regard to white men and how that changed over the first 50 or 60 years of the American Republic.